If you started watching this channel in the last year, then there's a good chance you missed out on a lot of our earlier videos. There was a lot of solid content there, so I do recommend you go back and check that stuff out. Nonetheless, you also probably missed that time I lived above a train. No, not that train, that train. Yeah. As it turned out, the first apartment I ever lived in Toronto was sat right on top of a subway station. And it was amazing. But it also wasn't amazing, and I'm going to tell you why. If you're not already, consider subscribing to the channel for more videos like this, and hit the bell icon so you get notified when new videos come out. Also consider joining our Discord community, where lots of transit enthusiasts come to talk about projects in various cities around the world. Living in an apartment on top of a train station was awesome, albeit in Toronto, unlike in Vancouver, you're unlikely to actually be able to see the trains, which isn't as great. To be clear though, these type of apartments aren't actually all that common in Toronto, especially outside of the downtown core. And in particular, this apartment was special, and it had a feature that around the world in all the cities I visited is quite uncommon. It was directly connected to the subway. This means that during a cold Toronto winter, without stepping outside, you could visit grocery stores, shopping malls, cinemas, and most of downtown Toronto without ever having to step outside. This is pretty cool, I must say. I remember visiting the Eaton Centre for a movie in January once and wearing a t-shirt. There are of course a lot of other benefits, not just directly related to transit. In true mixed-use development fashion, I was also situated on top of a number of convenience stores, other amenities, and a large grocery store. This was the pinnacle of convenience because anytime I wanted something, I could just walk downstairs and get it. It was that easy. Better yet, since the subway was below the grocery store and the grocery store was below my apartment, when I was coming home from a day of work, I could walk up from the subway into the grocery store, grab my groceries or whatever else I needed to get, and then continue walking up to my apartment. It was fantastic, and it was almost too good. This meant that I could live the dream of being able to make small, kind of interspersed grocery trips instead of the classic North American supply run to the grocery store in my SUV. Now to be clear, these sort of connections do exist in Vancouver as well, which if you didn't know is where I grew up and where I lived for the first 20 years of my life. But something interesting happened a few years ago in Vancouver. When Metrotown Station, the busiest outside of the downtown core, was rebuilt, the pedestrian bridge, which had directly linked it to the adjacent shopping mall, was removed, and it hasn't since been replaced. Now, originally, I was really upset about this, and to be honest, I'm still a little bit upset about it, because I do think direct connection between transit facilities and important buildings is a good idea. But the justifications I heard for the removal of this bridge, which were ancillary to be clear, the bridge had to be removed because the structure sort of changed, was that without having a direct pedestrian bridge, people were forced to go down to ground level and animate the streetscape, so to speak. Now to be clear, when I hear people talk about animating the streetscape in North America, I often roll my eyes, because usually what that means is a few benches here and a sidewalk cafe here, and still 8 lanes of traffic with cars. Basically, you can make the streetscape nice, but if you still have a ton of traffic and an unpleasant environment, no one's going to want to use those amenities. To be clear too, in Vancouver there seems to be a culture of less direct connections between transit-oriented development, the apartments and mixed-use development you see around transit stations, and the stations themselves. Now, that's probably in part because Vancouver's climate is less harsh, though to be clear, Vancouver gets a lot of rain, at least in the winter, so having covered connections isn't really a bad idea. There's actually one spot, near Lougheed Town Centre Station where I used to live, where there's actually a covered walkway through a parking lot to connect to a mall. It's literally just like an awning that goes through the parking lot. It's interesting to see. While direct connections are good, Vancouver seems to do fine by simply putting a condo building next to the station and providing a nice pedestrian connection so you can walk outside of your building and walk straight into the station. To be clear, Vancouver does have some good TOD connections as well. Having above ground stations helps, because often you'll get a pedestrian bridge that basically links directly from the station into a mall or other building. This actually might be a better approach than Toronto's underground station connection, since while the potential for a connection often exists, it seems that developers don't always make use of it. That could be a cost thing, and putting things above ground should simplify that. This is where everything falls apart for Toronto. North York Centre, which is the area where I used to live if you hadn't already figured out, if you're not from Toronto, I don't blame you, is terrible for pedestrians, and it need not be. There's tons of people, lots of shops and stores and great restaurants in the area. but the design of the streets and the urban environment is absolutely hostile to pedestrians and cyclists. In fact, a few years back when there was consultation going on for a cycling plan, instead of putting the cycling lanes directly on the 8 or 6 lane road that goes through the middle of the area, it was proposed to put the cycling lanes on the back streets so that cyclists were essentially second-class citizens who would have to walk or ride all the way around the block in order to get to the shops and other amenities that they might want to access. This is insane because cyclists have to walk or power their vehicle around the block. Drivers just get to drive. Of course, it's worth pointing out that this high-density area that was quite vibrant also had tons of on-street parking, though there was no room for bike lanes. Fortunately, just in the past year, a new plan has come out, and the plan is now to put bike lanes directly on Yonge Street. Now, when we're talking about direct connection, there's also the issue of health. While it's awesome while it's negative 20 degrees out to not have to go outside to get to your apartment building, I also think it may not be super healthy to never go outside, which you're often kind of lured to doing when you live in this sort of building. Being forced outside here and there might be a good thing. It forces you to be a little more connected with the weather and nature and the environment, and hey, if the weather's cold, you can throw on a jacket. It's not really a big deal. Now, suffice to say, all of this is a big problem because not everyone can live in a condo which is directly connected or at least directly adjacent to a transit facility. And as many of you probably know, North York Centre is comically polarized between high-rises and single-family homes. While I personally think the issue of the missing middle has somewhat been overplayed in North America, in this case it's hard to deny the middle is literally missing. I think part of the problem here is that when you have this dichotomy of people who live directly on top of transit, where access couldn't be better, and people who live in single-family homes, which probably don't use transit and have a car at their disposal, you create this divide. The people who have great transit access probably don't care much about having better pedestrian connections to local buildings when they can simply walk through a tunnel to get there. And the people who are driving their cars don't want better pedestrian and cycling infrastructure narrowing their essential roads. And due to the lack of better pedestrian and cycling infrastructure, less people want to live in the middle, there's probably less demand for housing in the middle, and the dichotomy remains. To be clear, there's also zoning issues and the like. I'm just making a point about what people desire to live in. To be clear as well, in condo high-rise heaven, there was very little green space that wasn't manufactured, so to speak. Parks are nice, but pocket parks aren't that great, and the whole denaturalization with perfect lawns and well-planted trees that aren't always maintained that well isn't necessarily the natural environment I think many people in the city would like to see. And then there's more issues. I, for one, as someone who thinks that Canada has a bit of a problem with a lack of choice, see a problem in the fact that people who live in a building that's directly attached to a transit facility and have a grocery store there with them are kind of naturally pushed in the direction of a single option. While that might lead to convenience, I think it's also the case that when living there for a few years, it felt like the facilities and the stores that existed there, that also existed in other places, were always, like totally chronically, worse than their counterparts in places where they actually had to compete with other businesses. There's also the issue of the fact that all of the stores that could afford to locate in this transit-oriented development were chains, which meant that you didn't have a lot of choice for smaller mom-and-pop shops, which often have more interesting variety and are just more pleasurable to shop at. Basically, the incumbents inside the transit-oriented development, in Toronto at least, benefited from the urban hellscape that would force people inside rather than outside to other stores. There's also the point of having a bit too much convenience. While it's great to have a store nearby, having a store directly under you means it's easy to make impulse purchases. And at least if you're a transit enthusiast, it's also easy to make impulse transit journeys. There's a lot of times I would actually head downtown for an hour or two and then come back up, because I don't mind riding on the subway and going downtown is convenient, so why not go to the Eden Centre for an hour or two? This did lead to me wasting a lot of time and getting to spend a lot of time on transit, but it probably wasn't ideal. The next issue was that walking around the area was totally miserable, and I don't say it for a lack of trying. While the single-family neighborhoods are good for a little stroll, they're quiet, there's not a lot of traffic, if you want to actually go somewhere, to do something, eat food, buy something, see a friend, you're going to have to go out on a big boulevard, which inevitably will have narrow sidewalks, tons of traffic, and drivers who don't care about you. And yes, I said it. The way Toronto drivers behave is crazy. As someone who drove and grew up in Vancouver, it's shocking to me how little regard Toronto drivers have for the safety of anyone else on the road. And it's one of those cases where people being better drivers would just be better for everyone. And this is part of the problem as well. If people who live at these transit-oriented developments don't necessarily like the transit, they just like the development, well, there's no reason for them to use the transit. Parking was ample, including free parking for people who wanted to come shop at the mall instead of having them use the transit. Beyond this, if people who live in the development want to go somewhere that they don't think public transit takes them or takes them conveniently, well, they'll simply drive. And I can't blame them. If transit isn't a good option, why would you use it? The problem was that there wasn't the transit supportive policy to make transit the best option. To be clear, this is one of the locations with the best transit in the city. Imagine other locations where there isn't a high quality transit line nearby. With all of that out of the way, when I came back to Toronto, I didn't move back to North York Centre. I wanted to live somewhere where a number of stores and rail transit were accessible, but where they weren't so close that I sort of abused them. In the new place I live, I'm closer to some high quality green space, and I have nice neighborhoods I can walk through in the nearby areas. I also have space to make my YouTube videos, which is exciting. In this land of few choices, I think it's important that you give yourself some. And I gave myself some with the place I relocated to. And best of all, I can see the trains.